Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're getting into something really heavy, excerpts from Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago, Volume 1.
Yeah, it's more than just a book, isn't it? He called it an experiment in literary investigation.
Right, and it's all about the Soviet prison system, specifically that period between, 1918 and 1956.
That's the focus, yes. And dedicated very powerfully to those who didn't live to tell their own stories.
You really feel the weight of that dedication.
Absolutely. And you have to remember the context, too. State security, the KGB's precursor, seized the manuscript. That forced his hand. He had to get it published.
Wow. So immense risk involved.
Immense. And in the dedication, he almost apologizes, asks forgiveness for not seeing everything, not remembering everything. It just shows the sheer, overwhelming scale of what he was trying to document.
So our mission today is really to dive into these specific excerpts and try to grasp the reality of arrests back then.
Exactly. What did it actually look like? What did it feel like?
Okay, so let's unpack this. What jumps out immediately is just how everywhere these arrests were. It wasn't specific circumstances, was it? It seems almost random.
Completely. That's one of Solzhenitsyn's core points. He lists example after example of arrests happening in the most mundane, unexpected places.
Like where?
Well, think about it. Not just political rallies, but factory corridors, maybe just after you showed your pass. Or even a military hospital bed while you're sick with a fever. He mentions Ernst Bemstein there.
It gets even more disturbing. People taken from the operating table.
Right. N.M. Vorobyev, 1936, having an ulcer operation. Imagine that. Or Nadia Levitskaya, arrested just trying to find out what happened to a relative, what their sentence was.
Just caught in the bureaucratic machine.
Or doing something completely ordinary, like shopping at a gastronome, one of those fancy food stores.
Yeah.
Or being kind to religious pilgrims passing through.
So everyday life became treacherous.
Absolutely. Suddenly, the person you encounter could be the one arresting you.
He lists them, doesn't he? Meter readers.
Meter readers, cyclists, railway conductors, taxi drivers, bank tellers, even the manager at the cinema. Any one of them might pull out that hidden maroon-colored ID card.
And by then it's too late.
Exactly. It fostered this deep suspicion. You couldn't know who to trust. Anyone might be an agent.
That anecdote about Grigoriev, the director of the Geological Institute?
Oh, no.
That's telling.
Isn't it? 1948, he barricades himself in his office, burning papers frantically when they come for him. He clearly understood what arrest meant.
Now, this is where it gets psychologically really fascinating. Solzhenitsyn talks about the reaction to being arrested. And it wasn't always just fear. Sometimes relief, even happiness.
It sounds completely counterintuitive, but yes, you have to understand the context. Arrests were so widespread, so seemingly inevitable for so many.
That the waiting became unbearable.
Precisely. The constant anxiety, the looking over your shoulder. Solzhenitsyn writes it was worse than any kind of arrest. The actual event, terrifying as it was, brought a kind of certainty. It ended the dread.
He gives examples, right?
Yes. Serdykova, a school teacher arrested way back, before the revolution even, connected to the Ulyanov case. She felt relief. And then there's Vasily Vlasov, a communist described as fearless.
What happened to him?
In the 1937 purges, the entire leadership of his district was arrested. But his arrest kept getting delayed, and it drove him to distraction. He felt he needed to be arrested to find peace.
That's deeply unsettling.
It is. And look at Father Irakli in 1934. They kept trying to arrest him at his Moscow apartment, but he was always away when he finally returned by train.
And his own parishioners stopped him.
Yes. They met him at the station and physically prevented him going home, terrified the authorities would finally get him. It shows the pervasive fear, but also that community trying to protect its own.
Okay, let's talk about the moment of arrest itself. It sounds like a very isolating, dehumanizing experience. Nothing public about it.
Very much so. Silent. Often no one around even realized what was happening. Solzhenitsyn contrasts the person's internal terror with how it might look to an outsider.
Just people walking together.
Yeah, maybe they looked like friends out for a stroll. Passers-by, completely unaware that someone's life was just shattered. It shows how normalized it had become.
He talks about his own arrest, doesn't he?
Yeah.
By Lozversh.
Yes, military counterintelligence at the Byelorussian station. And the details are almost comical, if they weren't so grim. The agents were obsessed with their war booty from Germany, 4 suitcases full.
More interested in the loot than in him.
Far more. He says he ended up having to carry his own suitcase, which contained the very diaries that incriminated him.
Incredible. But there was that moment with the brigade commander.
A brief flicker, yes,
Yeah.
unexpected. The commander, maybe feeling some shame, calls him back, speaks a few words. Given the power imbalance, the absolute authority of that arrest warrant the piece of paper with a seal. It was a small but remarkable act of decency.
Which brings us to the scale of it all. The sheer numbers involved in these purges.
Enormous. Solzhenitsyn stresses this wasn't just a few incidents, it was years of relentless purge activity swallowing huge numbers of people.
And not just the usual suspects, the political types.
Far from it. The net caught cursed intellectuals, restless students, even just eccentrics, truth seekers, holy fools, people who thought differently.
He even brings up Peter the Great.
Yeah, saying even Peter the Great tried and failed to purge Russia of independent thinkers. It suggests a deep historical pattern, sadly.
And the legal system couldn't cope?
It wasn't designed for this kind of mass repression. Solzhenitsyn explains that outdated legal processes were seen as obstacles to this hygienic purging, as the regime saw it.
So they bypassed it.
They adopted extrajudicial methods. The secret police basically became investigator, prosecutor, judge, jury, and executioner, all rolled into one.
And this idea of hostages, that's particularly chilling.
It is. Taking ordinary, peaceful citizens who hadn't even been accused of anything specific just to terrorize opponents or retaliate.
Like after the attempt on Lenin's life?
Exactly. August 30th, 1918. The NKVD orders the immediate arrest of right SR socialist revolutionaries and demands large numbers of hostages from the bourgeoisie and former officers. It was collective punishment on a massive scale.
And the targeting of political opponents started early? Spring 1918?
Very early. And ironically, targeting other socialist parties, SRs, Mensheviks, anarchists, people who had been revolutionaries themselves.
Suddenly they weren't revolutionary enough.
Suddenly they were accused of just pretending, of having a bourgeois essence that was conveniently discovered.
And specific events triggered crackdowns.
Yes, outlawing the cadets, the Liberal Party. Forcibly shutting down the Constituent Assembly, which had been democratically elected. Disarming regiments they didn't trust, kicking the socialists out of the local councils, the Soviets, after June 1918.
Even former allies weren't safe.
No. The left SRs, initially partners with the Bolsheviks, were targeted from July 1918 onwards.
And worker protests.
Even worker strikes and protests, the very things that pushed toward the new economic policy, were used as excuses to round up Mensheviks and SRs in night raids. Anarchists faced similar waves of arrests in 1918-1919.
And the SR leadership ended up in Butyrki prison.
The whole Central Committee held there until their big show trial in 1922.
There's that quote from Latsis, the Cheka figure.
Chilling, isn't it? Calling the Mensheviks a hindrance that needed to be removed from our path. Just cold, utilitarian calculation. Zero tolerance for dissent.
Then the focus shifts towards the intelligentsia.
Yes, starting around 1919, anyone considered close to the cadets, a very broad definition.
What did that include?
Scientists, university professors, artists, writers, engineers, basically the educated class, maybe 80% of them, he estimates, excluding only the most extreme writers or socialist theologians.
And these arrests were linked to fabricated plots.
Often, yes. Things like the National Center or the military plot were used as justifications for arrests and executions.
Lenin himself wasn't a fan of intellectuals.
He was deeply suspicious. He called the writer Korolenko a pitiful, petty bourgeois and suggested prison might do him good. Gorky protested, and Lenin admitted some mistakes, but the fundamental distrust remained.
Even religion wasn't left alone. The church.
No, the GPU, the Cheka successor, got involved in church affairs from spring 1922. The goal was to create a state-controlled living church.
How did they do that?
By arresting the head of the Orthodox Church, Patriarch Tikhon, and then holding trials, executing his supporters in Moscow and Metropolitan Veniamin in Petrograd.
What was the charge?
Essentially hindering the transfer of church power to this new state-approved body. It shows the drive for total control over every aspect of society, even belief.
Now, there's another layer to this hidden wave of arrests.
Yeah.
People targeted for not informing.
Yes, this is really insidious, especially in that first decade after the revolution. It wasn't publicized, but people who refused to become informers for the secret police faced serious consequences.
Why was refusal so common then?
Solzhenitsyn suggests many still held on to older ideas of morality. They hadn't fully accepted the regime's line that morality was purely relative, purely class-based. Refusing to spy on your neighbors felt like the right thing to do.
It was dangerous.
Extremely. He tells the stories of Magdalena Edzubova, 1927, arrested for not informing on engineers. And Nadezhda Surovets, same year, refused to spy on Ukrainian government members. She ended up doing 25 years in Kolyma. Horrific.
That resistance faded later.
By the 1930s, yes, the pressure became overwhelming, the logic shifted. If they ask you to inform, you just do it. There's no escape. Tragically, you even got volunteers, people informing out of fear or for gain.
Alongside these hidden arrests, there were the big public show trials.
Right. Very different purpose. These were theater designed for public consumption to shape the narrative.
Like the Shakti case.
Shakti in 1928, yes. Then the trial blaming people for the famine in 1930. And Palm Party, the Industrial Party trial, late 1930, all featuring dramatic, obviously coerced confessions.
What's the point of the Palm Party trial?
It was incredibly elaborate. It aimed to link various industrial problems and accidents into one massive conspiracy involving old enemies. Emigres like Miliukov, industrialists like Rybushinsky, even foreign powers. Deterring. Poincare. Pure fabrication to demonize opponents.
Let's talk about the kulaks. That term seems central.
It became central, yes, but its meaning was twisted. By 1930, kulak wasn't just a rich peasant. It was used against any strong, capable, independent peasant. Anyone who worked hard, managed well, or had strong convictions.
Why?
To break the back of the peasantry, essentially, to destroy their independence.
Which is ironic given the early promises about land.
Hugely ironic. The decree on land was only about 12 years earlier. It helped the Bolsheviks gain power by promising land to the peasants. Solzhenitsyn asks, how did these kulaks and poor peasants suddenly reappear so quickly after the Civil War?
And the process of liquidation was brutal.
Incredibly brutal. Successful farmers and their families were just torn from their homes, stripped of everything, and shipped off to the desolate North Tundra, taiga, often with extreme violence, no pretense of legality.
This leads to that pervasive atmosphere of fear. The don't be the first to stop applauding idea.
Yes, that chilling, unspoken rule. It wasn't just quirky, it was a mechanism of control.
Like social engineering.
Solzhenitsyn compares it to natural selection. The system weeded out independent thought, rewarded blind obedience, and he pushes back against the idea that the 37-38 terror mainly hit top communists.
He says that wasn't the case.
He argues there were probably only about 10% of the millions arrested. The vast majority were just ordinary people from every walk of life.
And the repression didn't stop there. 1940.
A wave of arrests targeting wives of prisoners just for not denouncing their husbands, and the absurdity continued.
Arresting a jazz orchestra.
The entire orchestra in Tambo of 1940, labeled enemies of the people. It shows the depth of the paranoia. And the Czech refugees?
What happened to them?
About 30,000 came seeking refuge in 39. They were suspected of espionage and sent to northern camps. Just unbelievable distrust. Many later fought with the Allies in the Czechoslovak Corps.
And when the Soviet Union expanded its territory.
1939, 1940 Poland, the Baltics, Bessarabia. This led to what they called social prophylaxis, basically purging anyone deemed potentially troublesome, independent, influential, wealthy, intelligent, especially Poles.
Solzhenitsyn connects this to Katyn.
He draws links between these purges, the Katyn massacre, and stockpiled supplies found later in northern camps, suggesting preparations for Polish prisoners like those under Sikorsky and Anders.
And officers were targeted too.
Across the board, to eliminate potential leaders of any resistance, to ensure silence and obedience.
The purges went deep into the military itself.
Oh, yes. Both the active army fighting in the West and the inactive army stationed in the Far East and Mongolia.
Why the Far East Army? They weren't fighting.
That was the point, according to the special branches, the internal security. They needed to keep them from getting rusty, ideologically speaking. Maintain control.
The accusations sound absurd. That story about Kaverznev.
Changing his name to Kolbe in 1918, and later exiled just because he couldn't prove his innocence, it's Kafkaesque. The burden of proof was entirely reversed.
And the soldiers in the East were confused about the retreats in the West.
They were. Some apparently thought it was a strategic masterstroke, like Kutuzov against Napoleon. This kind of thinking, questioning orders even implicitly, couldn't be tolerated, so more purges were needed to enforce faith in silence.
After the war ended, things didn't get better for everyone. Returning emigres.
Another wave. Russians who had emigrated years ago caught up as the Soviet army advanced through the Balkans and Central Europe in 44-45. Young and old, swept into the Gulag.
And Japanese prisoners.
Huge numbers imprisoned, likely far beyond legitimate POWs. Partly revenge, partly just needing labor for the camps. And then, perhaps the cruelest twist, Soviet POWs returning from Nazi camps.
What happened to them? They survived horrors like Buchenwald.
only to be treated with suspicion back home. Why did you survive? How? Many were imprisoned in Soviet camps as potential traitors or spies.
It was an impossible situation for them.
Utterly impossible. Surrendering was treason. But joining anti-Soviet units like Vlasov's army meant certain death if recaptured. Solzhenitsyn argues their motive wasn't cowardice, but sheer desperation and hatred for the Soviet regime that abandoned them.
The whole system relied heavily on denunciations and interrogations, didn't it?
Absolutely central, and designed to extract confessions, build cases, often from nothing. Article 93 of the Criminal Code even allowed anonymous denunciations to start a case. Imagine the fear that bred. Interrogators used brutal methods, not just physical, but psychological.
Like demanding confessions without saying what for.
Exactly. Kaikin did that to Skripnikova in 1927, Vykovsky in 1929, and again to Anna Skripnikova in 1952, an older woman. The interrogator threatened to use sleep deprivation to raise her already high blood pressure. Just cruel manipulation.
And Vyshinsky's relative truth.
That provided the ideological cover. Convictions based not on facts, but on the interrogator's party sensitivity, their moral forces, essentially their willingness to be ruthless. Objective truth just didn't matter.
The methods themselves.
Yeah.
Sleep deprivation, hunger.
Intensified hunger, Shulpanev dangling borscht. Trobotaryov kept awake for 72 hours straight, interrogators working in shifts, forcing him to sign fabricated confessions about meeting Japanese generals he'd never met, who supposedly drank vodka he hated, and physical torture, too.
Like the bridling.
The swan dive, yes, used in notorious places like Sukhanovka prison and Archangel. Pure agony.
And leading questions, forcing people to invent stories.
Yes, feeding them details, making them construct the narrative the interrogator wanted. Add to that the horrific overcrowding in cells, 30 people in a tiny cell in Vladimir prison in 1948.
Seeing what happened to others must have been terrifying.
More effective than threats sometimes, Solzhenitsyn notes. Seeing the results of torture, and the psychological games putting up portraits of Lenin during interrogation to induce guilt.
Even personal letters were used.
Anything. A vague phrase, a friend's reply, suddenly it's evidence of conspiracy. You'd be forced to invent reasons for meetings, conversations. And the paranoia extended everywhere, even interrogators were watched, had to sign in and out.
He calls the interrogators the blue caps, the pale night executioners.
What chilling phrase. Often anonymous figures to their victims.
And not necessarily brilliant minds.
No. He describes them as often lacking broad education or logical thinking. Their main qualifications were obedience and utter imperviousness to suffering, both the prisoners and perhaps their own conscience. They knew the cases were often fake, but they produced the paperwork.
Like the criminals saying, you today, me tomorrow.
That cynical underworld credo seemed to permeate the system. Interrogator Mironenko in 1944 basically said interrogation and trial were just formalities, judicial corroboration for a decision already made.
And status didn't protect you.
Kushnariev said he wouldn't release someone just because they were a Leningrad or even a senior communist. It was arbitrary. Interrogators sometimes seemed detached, almost amused by finding new ways to persuade.
And corruption among them.
Lack of restraint could lead to theft, enjoying privileges denied to others. But, importantly, Solzhenitsyn also notes rare exceptions.
Moments of humanity.
Yes. The young lieutenant who warned Father Shapovalnikov and later became his decent escort. Lieutenant Ovsyannikov, who supported Solzhenitsyn. Small acts, but significant in that context.
Entering prison must have been a massive shock.
Profoundly disorienting. Solzhenitsyn says he felt like a veteran prisoner after just a short time under interrogation. It aged you psychologically instantly.
And completely cut off from the world.
Total information blackout. He didn't even know about the Yalta Conference while being interrogated. The prison routine itself was oppressive, forced waking, especially hard after night interrogations. Trying to steal sleep meant severe punishment.
He mentions Viktor Belov, the chauffeur.
Yeah. Drove for Khrushchev, other big names. Got disillusioned, wrote a proclamation, arrested. Significantly, 10 people knew and didn't turn him in. Small acts of solidarity.
And Solzhenitsyn felt a duty to the POWs.
A profound sense of duty. To share their suffering, tell their story. Because they were just dismissed as traitors, abandoned by their own country. It's heartbreaking.
The transports between prisons sound horrific, the Stolopin cars.
Specially adapted railway cars, unbelievably overcrowded, almost no water, limited toilet access, and the guards often cruel, impatient, the story of the one-legged German, Schultz. Just callousness.
Rations cut after victories.
Ironically, yes. Less bread after they beat Germany and Japan. Prisoners had to organize themselves just to survive, like Sanyan and Mereshkov's supplementing rations.
They often didn't know where they were going.
Just shipped off into the vastness of the Gulag, destination unknown, adds to the terror. He tells that strange story of Max Santerre, the Frenchman accidentally swept up, and the mistaken identity case, Yevrashkin and Zvyaga, pure chaos.
Arrival at the camp meant more degradation.
Slave caravans marching in snow and summer clothes, endless counting, police dogs, and then confiscation of everything you owned, like in Magadan, your old life gone.
But even inside, there were remarkable people. Timofey Vrosovsky,
The famous geneticist, imprisoned but still recognized internationally. Schrödinger cited him. Or the German air ace forced into a Soviet uniform. And Solzhenitsyn notes the resilience, the ethics among political prisoners.
what about Solovki, the island prison?
Initially, it was relatively better, especially for the early socialists imprisoned there. But their old tactics, like hunger strikes learned under the Tsar,
Didn't work.
useless. The Soviet jailers had no conscience, no fear of public opinion like the Tsarist ones sometimes did. Valentinov had success under the Tsar. Here, it was futile, though some prisoners, like in Orel, managed to organize appeals.
And the TON's special purpose prisons.
Yes, for isolating certain groups. Foreigners, purged officials, socialists, later camp rebels, thief leaders. Also for those too sick for labor, like the blind Kopeikin. Even transport details added to the misery: salty fish then, no water, limited toilet breaks.
And the thieves, the Blatny, had it easier in some ways.
Often, yes. Easier interrogations, later sentences, better chance of amnesty or escape. They had their own network, even in prison. They were proud of being thieves, and the authorities often tolerated them more than politicals.
And they preyed on others.
Taking rations from the Freira, the non-criminal, innocent prisoners during transport, was common.
Life on death row sounds bleak.
Grim glimpses, playing dominoes with matchbox bits, Vlasov telling jokes, Kolpakov in silent despair, Vlasov defiant to the end. A strange contrast to Krasikov reading Marx and Peter and Paul Fortress before the revolution, but he only did a year.
And February 1917 saw the prisons emptied.
A brief dawn. All politicals released.
The book includes glossary terms, right? Turkey, Cheka.
Essential context. And names figures like Krylenko, the prosecutor involved in so many trials. The book is packed with examples of injustice.
Like prosecuting a newspaper.
Ruski Vedomosti, just for an article. Bribery in the Cheka itself, the Kosyrov case, the relentless targeting of Patriarch Tikhon, blaming technical specialists, the Spetsy, for economic failures.
The Oldenburger case is interesting.
Accused of sabotage in the water system, but the workers defended him against the party. Shows a disconnect between official narrative and reality on the ground.
Tikhon's trial. The defense lawyer's words.
Poignant but futile, wasn't it? Talking about history, martyr's blood, fell on deaf ears. Accusations of theft, blasphemy, just a show. Like the SR trial in 1922, no defense lawyers, Pyatakov presiding harshly, prosecutor manipulating everything, a template for future trials.
And they struggled to set up the big Wreckers trial before Promporty.
Yes, Khrennikov died under interrogation, Fedotov wasn't suitable. Then suddenly Ramzan appears, willing to confess to anything and everything, providing this incredibly elaborate false testimony.
And figures like Ramzan then denounced the whole intelligentsia during the trial.
Yes, Ramzan, Larachev, Ochkin turning on their own class, echoing the party line.
The confession methods were consistent. Yakubovich.
Endless sleeplessness, confronted with broken prisoners forced to testify against him. And Teitelbaum, wanting to be recruited into an anti-Soviet group just to avoid being a common criminal, speaks volumes about the desperation.
But Yakubovich had that moment of defiance in his trial.
Unexpectedly, yes. A powerful outburst against the Menshevik foreign delegation, and Bukharin trying to clear his name, leading the prosecutor to admit there was no objective proof. Small cracks, but the machine rolled on.
Using testimony from a dead man, Stavarov.
Utterly farcical, the basis of the charge, and the defendants immediately retracted their own coerced confessions in court. It didn't matter. Even asking about bread lines was twisted by the regime.
Krylenko's explanation for Shastny's execution.
Pure cynicism. Not being executed, he's being shot. Playing with words when capital punishment was supposedly abolished, then officially brought back June 1918. The scale of executions early on was immense.
And Strakovich, the scientist who survived.
On a death list, but he angrily retracted his false confession during interrogation and somehow lived. But medical care for death row, non-existent.
Sentencing became automatic. The directive system.
Judge just applied the standard sentence for the time. 10 years and 37, 25 years and 49. Judicial independence was gone. Lawyers were shocked in 1958 when a draft law didn't even include grounds for acquittal.
And figures like Trotsky and Zinoviev endorsed terror early on.
Laid the ideological foundation. And comparing Tsarist executions to the Bolshevik period,
Right.
the scale under the Soviets was vastly, terrifyingly greater. Krylenko summed up the legal philosophy. Judge people on what they might do, not what they did. Utterly arbitrary.
And that final quote, make Citizeness Ivanova pay for her smile.
Chilling. Captures the petty cruelty, the absolute unchecked power.
So this deep dive into Solzhenitsyn,
Yeah.
it really lays bare the sheer scope, the devastating impact of this arrest system from 1918 to 1956.
Absolutely. The scale is one thing, but it's the arbitrary nature, the randomness that comes through so strongly, and the psychological destruction.
Yeah, the toll on individuals,
Yeah.
the brutality of interrogation, the reality of the prisons, the camps.
And how it was used to crush any hint of dissent, targeting group after group. It was a fundamental twisting of justice itself.
Looking back at this material today, it really underscores the importance of truth, doesn't it? And memory.
And vigilance. Understanding how these abuses of power happened is crucial, even all these decades later. The Gulag Archipelago is a harrowing read, but it's a vital testament.
A reminder of how fragile freedom could be.
Exactly. And a call to remember those who suffered and perhaps to explore this history further. There's so much more there.